Hey guys, so today we're going to talk about scientific variables. In science, we use variables in experiments to understand their relationship between each other. And variables are normally, it comes to graphs, you find variables on the x and y axis. And we'll talk about it more with other graphing examples. So, variables are factors that may change or vary in an experiment when we are testing things and processes. There are two main types of variables: independent variables and dependent variables. Let's talk about independent variables. Notice that the x-axis has a variable, which is time of day, and then the y-axis has a variable, which is temperature. They're both changing within the graph, and based on the line, we can see what type of relationship that they may have. So independent variables are not affected by other variables. They are independent of other variables. For instance, some examples could be time, which is day, can be day, year, month, hour, etc. Time is not affected by anything, but things can change based on time. But time is not changed by anything. Time is time. Depth of ground, or how deep something is within the ground, how far below the ground something is. um, the ground will not change, the depth of the ground will not change, but things may change as you go deeper underground. So that's why the depth of ground is an independent variable. Locations don't change. I mean, locations aren't affected by other things, other variables, but things may change or things may be affected based on the location. For instance, climate can be different based on different locations, but locations aren't different because of climate. Altitude or elevation are independent variables. So altitude or elevation, the higher something is in the sky, is not dependent on anything, but um, clouds can be dependent on the altitude or elevation. Where you have snow on the top of the peaks of mountains can be dependent on elevation or altitude. The temperature can be dependent on altitude or elevation, but altitude or elevation is not dependent on any of those things. Finally, density is something we'll talk about. Density is an inherent part of everything, and it's basically the relationship between the mass and the volume of an object. And the density of an object is the density of an object. It is not affected by any other variables. It's basically the identity of an object, the identity of the molecule itself. So yeah, independent variables are not affected by other variables, and they are independent of other variables. And you can see here, time of the day in my graph is my independent variable. It's not affected by anything. Time is, but temperature is affected by time as time goes or changes within the day. They're both changing, but one is being affected by the other. The other one is staying unaffected. The one that's not being affected is the independent variable. So, what are dependent variables? Dependent variables are affected by other variables. They are dependent on and they change based on other variables. So, in this case, temperature changes based on the time of the day. That's why it's a dependent variable. But time of the day is independent of temperature. It is not based on anything, it's not affected by temperature, but they're both variables because they're both changing within the graph. So let's look at dependent variables, the blue, and the independent variables, red, in a sentence. Temperature is dependent on the time of the day. Temperature is the dependent variable. It's dependent on the time of the day. Percentage of copper is dependent on the depth within the earth. Percentage of copper is the dependent variable, and it's dependent on the depth within the earth, but the depth within the earth is not dependent on copper. CO2 concentration in the air is dependent on the year. So we're emitting lots of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and it's slowly increasing over time, and it's dependent on time, or you can say year. But the year or time is not dependent on the CO2 concentration in the air. And the amount of precipitation in a location is dependent or can be dependent on the month. So amount of precipitation would be the dependent, and the month would be the independent variable.